As a community foundation dedicated to improving life in our region, the New York Community Trust helps caring viewers like you to turn assets into a force for good. Consider joining your fellow New Yorkers who've chosen the New York Community Trust to amplify their giving today and to carry out their charitable legacies for generations to come.
Hello, and welcome to the very first conversation in our new series, The State of New York from the 92nd Street Y. This series is intended to serve as a platform for fostering meaningful dialogue. We'll introduce you to the decision makers who run New York, giving you the opportunity to learn more about what makes our city tick and to gain insight into the pressing issues that shape our lives. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of 92NY, and today we're turning our attention to the environment, exploring how to make our city more livable, more sustainable, and more resilient as our environment is changing around us. Our special guest for this conversation is Rohit Aggarwala, Commissioner of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. After our conversation, we'll be joined by distinguished journalists and New York City experts, Nicole Gelinas, Errol Louis, and Brigid Bergin, who will lend their perspectives on the topics covered with Commissioner Aggarwala. Before proceeding, a brief word about the format for this series. We at 92NY believe in the power of community and the importance of viewing our world from diverse perspectives. And so, in preparing for these conversations, we've actively sought the input of you, the members of our community, regarding the topics that we plan to discuss, and have used that input to shape our discussion and even the specific questions that we're asking. We're so grateful that you've graciously contributed your thoughts, concerns, and ideas regarding these topics. Thank you for having done so, and thank you for joining us today. Now, let's join Commissioner Aggarwala.
Hello. It's great to have you here, Commissioner Aggarwala. You and I have actually known each other for many, many years, so I hope it's okay with you if I call you by Rit. Does that work?
Please, definitely. Good to see you.
Well, thank you and welcome to the show. So I wanted to start with your role at DEP. You have many different responsibilities in city government, but your primary role is as commissioner of the city's Department of Environmental Protection. And maybe just as a very basic way to open, can you share with our viewers what DEP does? It's one of the most important agencies in New York City government, and yet I think to many outsiders, its responsibilities are somewhat opaque.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk about DEP, which is an amazing agency. And I often like to talk about the fact that as much as we love and need the police and the streets and the teachers and all of that, there is only one agency that every New Yorker has a physical relationship with before 8 a.m. every day, right? And that is the water system. And that's what DEP is. We're a little bit more than that. We also enforce the air and noise codes for New York City. But the bulk of DEP's operations are really about providing all New Yorkers with clean, safe drinking water. We have the highest quality drinking water of any American city, and wastewater. And so dealing with the sewage and the stormwater that comes off the streets, which we treat in our 14 wastewater treatment plants around the city. I'm actually here at our Newtown Creek plant in Brooklyn right now, and ensure, therefore, that we only release clean water into the harbor. And it's actually through DEP's actions funded by the water bills that New Yorkers pay. That's something that relatively few people appreciate, is that we are not covered through the general taxes that New Yorkers pay, but through the water bills that homeowners are keenly aware of. But if you live in an apartment, you've never paid a water bill because your building pays for that. And those water bills have allowed DEP to make investments over the last nearly 200 years. Really, our infrastructure dates back originally to 1837 with the beginning of construction on the Croton Reservoir system. But over the last 20 years, we've invested so much that our harbor is now cleaner than it has been since the Civil War. And that's why today, unlike a generation ago, we routinely have whales and dolphins and seahorses and all sorts of marine life in the harbor.
And let me ask you this. I guess the drinking water is the more pleasant half of your water-related responsibilities, but wastewater is also important. And something that I learned that I think many New Yorkers don't understand is that our rainwater and our sewers, our sewage share certain systems in common, and that when we have very heavy rains, sometimes that rainwater overwhelms the system, and as a result of that, the city actually still discharges raw sewage into our waterways. And I know that over the last many years, the city's invested a ton of money to ensure that that happens less frequently. And one of the things that I know you're focused on is making it even less frequent than it is now. Would you be willing to share a little bit about what DEP is doing to make this a less common occurrence?
Happy to. And yeah, so, first of all, the state of the art for sewers that were started really in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century is what you've described, a combined sewer system. So the sewage from your toilet and your kitchen sink, that's sanitary sewage, and stormwater collected in the catch basins and other places on the street, they all merge. And so it's true in London, it's true in European cities, it's true in pretty much all of the older American cities. We have a combined sewer system. Actually, about 2/3 of New York City is a combined sewer system by area. So the parts of New York City that were really developed after World War II, a large part of those have separate sewers. So it was what we call an MS4 system. And so we don't have this problem anywhere near as much in those part of the cities. But yeah, so what happens is that because a rainstorm generates massive quantities of water, so just by way of comparison, New York City uses a total of about 1 billion gallons of water a day. If we get a 1/4 inch of rain across all of New York City, that is another billion gallons, right? And so if you get a 1/2 inch of rain or a 1-inch rainstorm, you've actually in a 1-inch quintupled the amount of water that is flowing through the sewers. And if we let all of that follow the normal course and go through our treatment plants, that volume of water would destroy our treatment plants. What it would actually do is kill the biological environment that we create in our treatment plants, because another thing very few people appreciate, we don't treat sewage with mechanical or chemical processes. It's actually a biological process. And so here at this treatment plant, we have gigantic tanks with all sorts of bacteria that literally eat all the sludge, all the poop, all the stuff that's in the sewer, and turn it into natural biological products that actually becomes great fertilizer and other things that we create out of it. But that cleans the water. It's exactly the same natural process as happens in a swamp. We just accelerate it here with a little bit of mechanical means. And then we do add some chlorine and then take the chlorine out again before it goes into the river. But nonetheless, if we let that volume of water flow through that quote unquote swamp, it would kill all that bacteria. And so we protect it by diverting that pulse of water into the river. As you say, the numbers have gone down dramatically. In the 1990s, we were generally putting 100 billion gallons of raw sewage into the harbor every year. Last year, we were at 17, which is way too much, way more than we would like, but more than 80% decrease. And that is one of the major reasons that the harbor is so much cleaner than it has been. As you say, there are agreed upon plans. So this is something that is heavily regulated by the state on behalf of the federal government through the Clean Water Act. And so we have agreed upon plans that will lead to billions of dollars of additional investment over the next 15 years or so. They really go out until about 2040. But another thing, as you pointed out, that Mayor Adams just announced a couple of weeks ago in our latest sustainability plan, Plan YC, is a commitment that we will now start planning for the post-2040 period of how we are actually going to get to a zero combined sewer overflow world. We're not quite sure how we would do that. That's a very expensive potential investment. The in some ways easiest, certainly the most direct way to do that is a lot of underground gray infrastructure. But a lot of the progress we've made in New York over the last decade has been in green infrastructure, rain gardens and bioswales and things like that. And we're certainly going to be looking to see how we can expand that as much as possible.
So let me pick up on something that you were just describing, which was preserving and enhancing the experience of New Yorkers vis-a-vis the harbor and our waterways. Our waterways are among the greatest resources that we have, one of the great amenities of living in this incredible city. But about 10 years ago, when Hurricane Sandy occurred, we also saw the waterways turn into one of the great menaces facing the city. And as we look forward in time, thanks to climate change, it's clear that those dangers are only going to become greater. As part of our preparation for this conversation, we went out and spoke to our community and asked them if they had questions for you. And people were very interested in your role as Chief Climate Officer, which is another part of your area of responsibility in New York City government. And a question that was asked was about how much progress we've made since Hurricane Sandy. I know that the city was heavily focused on climate change pre-Sandy, but I think that the experience of Sandy brought home the risks of climate change in a way that very few pure conversations on the topic could successfully achieve. And so the question that I had for you is, are we better prepared today for the changes that are coming our way because of climate change? Have we used the last 10 years well, and what are our plans going forward?
It's an important topic, and you know, of course, you personally played a major role in the post-Sandy planning with the SIRR. You know, the way I would say it is, we are certainly better off than we were a decade ago, but unfortunately, I think the climate is changing faster than anyone had predicted even a decade ago. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, that every time new climate change estimates and projections come out, they're always at the high end of the previous set of projections. So the rate of climate change is accelerating, and it's not yet clear to me that the rate of our ability to react to it is accelerating at the same extent. Some of that has to do with the general sense of urgency. And as you point out, you know, in the original Plan YC, the city's first sustainability plan in 2007, there are photos and images that show here's where flooding might occur at the Holland Tunnel, for example. And it was eerily on target for what actually took place during Hurricane Sandy. But at the time, people were saying, it's a crazy idea. It'll never happen. It's stuff a bunch of eggheads say. Don't listen to them, right? Hurricane Sandy made it very clear. We had another wake-up call 2 years ago with Hurricane Ida, which reminded us that it's not just the coastal inundation that we suffered at Sandy. It's also rainwater that could kill us, and in that case, killed 11 New Yorkers. Frankly, just the other day, as you know, with the Canadian wildfires, we saw a record-setting air quality problem in New York City. And frankly, until last week, I think most New Yorkers thought, yeah, wildfires are something that happens out west, right? Or in Asia, right? Or somewhere else, but it's not a New York thing. So climate change is going to continue to throw new things at us. I think what these lived experiences are doing is creating the sense of urgency, creating the political window to actually make some of the difficult investments. I think specifically in terms of how we've used the last decade, I think many New Yorkers appreciate that there are a number of major projects underway. So there's a completed project on the Rockaways, actually performed very well to protect the beach side of the Rockaways from flooding back in December of last year, when we had a major nor'easter that occurred at a king tide, the highest tide of the month. Unfortunately, the bay side of the Rockaways did experience flooding because that project had not yet started. Those are two projects with the Army Corps. Most notably, of course, is the project on East Side Coastal Resilience on the Lower East Side that is under construction and many people have seen. And there's a lot more work in other parts of the city that are at various stages, Red Hook, the South Shore of Staten Island, et cetera. Particularly underappreciated, I think, though, is all of the work that's happened at the building scale. So you can do resilience by keeping the water out, and we've got to do that. The Army Corps has a major project. We're going to be standing up a Bureau of Coastal Resilience at DEP to address that and centralize the work of the city on building coastal resilience. You also have to have it at the building scale. One of the biggest problems after Sandy was that so many buildings had all of their electrical equipment destroyed by flooding in the basement. And even, for example, at NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, we have put something on the order of $500 million over the last decade into hardening those buildings, whether moving equipment out of the basement or waterproofing it, so that those buildings might still get flooded. They might lose a day of service, but they're not going to have their elevators out for a month or 3 months, like some buildings had in the aftermath of Sandy. We are also going to have to help homeowners and educate homeowners on the fact that they're going to have to play a role in protecting themselves, because there is no way to completely protect New Yorkers from climate. And it's just one of the sad realities that for 400 years, New Yorkers have lived in a really mild climate where our infrastructure can basically protect us. If you live in the Midwest, you know that tornadoes are going to get you, and you've got to play a role in protecting yourself. If you live on the West Coast, you know that earthquakes are a risk that you've got to protect yourself against. New Yorkers are going to have to play a role in their own protection as well.
So I want to build off of what you were just saying about investments that we're going to need to make. And the flip side of your responsibilities with respect to resilience, which is ensuring that the city is prepared for the impacts of climate change, is sustainability. And with sustainability, we as a city try to do our part to ensure that what happens thanks to climate change is mitigated as much as possible by reducing our carbon footprint. And I had a philosophical question for you, which is this. The centerpiece of our efforts to reduce our climate footprint is Local Law 97. Local Law 97 requires buildings to become more carbon neutral by improving building systems, et cetera. And if they do, then under the new law, then they don't face fines. If they don't, then they could face significant fines. The estimates today are that something like 85% of commercial office buildings, 85% of residential buildings don't comply with the 2030 standards, and therefore will face significant fines. The question I have for you is this. If these buildings face fines, those fines will be passed along to office tenants, to residents, making the city less affordable. If the city is less affordable, potentially people will leave the city and go to other places. New York today is one of the most carbon efficient places in the country. And therefore, presumably, if they leave New York, those individuals are going to have larger carbon footprints. Is that an outcome that actually benefits the planet? Or would we be better off just trying to make New York a more affordable city, draw as many people in here, and just by nature of their living in New York, have those individuals have smaller carbon footprints than they would if they lived elsewhere?
Well, look, it's an important point, and of course, Local Law 97, as you say, is the most important of New York City's initiatives to reduce its own carbon footprint. You're right that right now, New York City, and I think we're neck and neck this year with San Francisco on a per capita basis in terms of our carbon emissions. And it has been true, probably for a very long time, that New York's the most carbon efficient city in the country, or place in the country, because of our transit orientation, because large buildings tend to be more efficient than single family homes. One of the things that we really face over the next decade, though, is that those particularly suburban areas are actually going to catch up, because it's easy to convert. If you're a single family home and you put solar on your roof and you get an electric vehicle, you've basically eliminated your carbon footprint. And that's a much more straightforward and potentially consumer-driven transition than what we have in New York City, where even as the electric grid cleans up, a large portion of our energy consumed in buildings comes from natural gas that we use for heating and cooling. And that's actually the toughest nut for us to crack. It is actually, I'd argue, a risk for New York if we do not keep pace, because we will wind up being the laggard in this. And that will, I think, cause us long-term costs as the natural gas grid declines and those costs begin to accelerate. But I think you're also right in saying that we need to manage this. What you've described just leads me to point out, as I often do, that I think it's terrible that we refer to Local Law 97, right? It was the Climate Mobilization Act. And that is really what is necessary, that between now and 2030, as you say, there's a whole host of work that has to get done in New York City buildings. You can think about it as a cost. Some of the projects that you have to do are actually going to be able to pay for themselves. It's also going to be a big energy generator and lead to a state-of-the-art situation in many buildings that do this kind of work, where realistically, as we all know, a lot of New York buildings actually just limp along by patching old equipment and not going ahead to make it efficient, make it better performing. So there's a lot of upside here if we do this right. And one of the things I think this administration, the Adams administration, is clearly committed to is figuring out how to help buildings through this mobilization. We're going to use the fines as a stick to prod people who are not willing to work with us, not willing to try to do the work. But we are committed to new financing tools, thinking about how we can get federal money and state money to help building owners do this kind of work. And I think as it happens, people will realize, as with many mandates, it's often not as difficult as they think it is. There are going to be some edge cases where there are really difficult building types or pieces of equipment to change, but I think the vast majority of buildings are going to find that it's easier to comply than they appreciate right now.
Well, Commissioner Aggarwala, Rit, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Literally, the fate of millions of New Yorkers is in your hands, and we're lucky to have someone who is as thoughtful about these topics as you, thinking about our future. So thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Pleasure to talk to you, Seth, as always. Thank you.
Welcome to our panelists. We're excited to engage in a conversation following up on the interview that we conducted a couple of days ago with Commissioner Aggarwala. And the first place I wanted to start is on a topic that we only touched on briefly in the conversation, but has been prominent in the news over the last couple of weeks, which is air quality. This is one of the many responsibilities that DEP has. We all lived through the recent problems with air quality here in the city, thanks to the wildfires in Quebec. And I'm wondering if you could answer two questions for me. One is, I'm curious what your thoughts were about how the city responded to this scary and, for us at least, highly unusual situation. But also I'm curious to hear what you thought about how the press responded to it, and whether you think that the reporting was informative, whether we were hyping the situation, and just as professional reporters, how you view how your industry handled this particular episode. So maybe we'll start with Brigid, and I'd be interested in hearing from all of you.
Sure. I think it was an unusual event. As the commissioner said during his interview with you, I think it was very much the first time a lot of New Yorkers started to feel the sense that this phenomenon that we have seen in the news occurring out west could actually happen at home. And that we need to be thinking about how are we going to prepare ourselves for some of these inevitable changes as a result of climate change that are going to change the way we live and we act and we conduct our life. And here in New York is particularly how we commute and how we get around. In terms of the response from the city, I think we are still to some degree unpacking how it was handled. But, as someone who covered, part of the Bloomberg administration, all of the de Blasio administration, I know that you're used to seeing a mayor sort of in their mayoral garb at the Office of Emergency Management the moment something like that begins. And I think we can say pretty fairly that that started much later in that particular incident than what most of us have become accustomed to, starting to hear a clear message from the administration about what was happening and what that meant to New Yorkers and how they should change their life. That happened late. And I think there's still questions about why that happened, why a tweet the night that it started was the first information New Yorkers were getting about how they should go about changing their patterns of life, except for people who were associated with the mayor, who he apparently called. So there's that piece of it. And then in terms of the media coverage, I will speak particularly for my colleagues at WNYC and Gothamist. I'm very proud of the coverage they did. I think they did some good work in terms of trying to be clear and level-headed about, what the air quality index was and why people should be looking at it. We spoke to a lot of scientists and doctors, cardiologists, people who could bring expertise to the situation and how people, again, how their health could be affected and what they could do to, protect themselves, how they could protect themselves inside, how they could protect themselves outside. And so I think some of that coverage was important. And I think some of the coverage of the administration and the timing of their communication was also warranted because we know that these types of situations are going to happen again.
Errol, what is your thought on that topic?
I want to underscore what Brigid said. She said it very politely, but the reality is it was slightly outrageous, the administration's response, to be honest with you. When you finally put together the TikTok, is what we would call it in our newsroom, it turns out the administration sort of knew some things fairly early in the day. The mayor acknowledged that he called relatives and said, stay inside. Things may not be safe outside. And then the rest of us got the alert at 11:30 that night. That's not acceptable. And the effort to try and recast it as something that was unprecedented and therefore the administration didn't really have a fair yardstick by which to be judged, I don't know if that really holds water. Frankly, it goes back to a pattern of what we've seen with other crises, some of them man-made. But the reality is this administration, I think, has yet to assemble or really put in place a comprehensive emergency communications plan on how it will talk with the city about storms, floods, unprecedented events, migrants that we didn't expect, whatever it may be. It is an accepted part. I mean, this stuff is written down. This isn't just like a oral tradition or custom that he might want to follow. It's written in manuals about how to communicate in a pandemic, how to communicate in a flood. The Federal Emergency Management Agency comes by New York One, my newsroom, every so often to kind of kick the tires. We're considered part of the emergency response system. So this administration, I think, got, if anything, it might be lucky that it happened fairly early in the term, but they, I think, have got to really sort of tighten things up so that we can help them do their job by doing our job, by conveying to the public exactly what is going on.
And to the extent that there may have been a vacuum in information coming out of City Hall, do you think that the way that the press filled that vacuum was responsible? Are there things that, in looking at the way the press handled this, you wish that in retrospect the press had done differently?
Well, I tell you what we did, which I think a lot of other newsrooms did too. We have an in-house meteorologist. Our guy is named John David. He's been here for over 20 years. And he sits in the back and he sort of plays with his computers and works out his own models. And we tried to have him explain to people what was happening and why it was happening, which winds were bringing, which combination of wind and climate was bringing the smoky air here, why it was here, what were his best probabilities about it leaving the next day or the day after that. If anything, that I think might have been lacking on our side that we probably all could have done a little bit better is make sure we had our health reporters involved too, with very explicit advice to people who have children that have asthma or other respiratory conditions. You know, instead of saying generally, well, if you've got a respiratory condition, this might be a good day to stay home. We could have drilled down probably a little bit better and been a little bit more precise about that.
And maybe Nicole, to ask more explicitly, one of the things that did jump out at me about the coverage was that rather than just focusing on the fact that this was an event that was caused by a particular set of circumstances in a particular place that was going to last for a couple of days, immediately the jump was to this is an example of what's coming our way for our future in connection with climate change. I think the New York Times ran a headline that said, will wildfires like these become the new normal? And only when you read through the story did you find out at the end that they were saying, well, actually, probably not, but there are other things we should be concerned about. And do you think that that is the right way to report about things like this? And what is your thought about the city's response?
Sure. Thank you, Seth. Yes, I think we prefer to focus on the long term because it lets us off the hook for the short term. Both the long term and the short term are important, but what we do in the short term obviously affects the long term. And I think there are two places where the city may not have risen to the occasion in the short term. One is not so much the information that was imparted by the mayor. I certainly agree with my colleagues that the mayor was slow to get this information about what one should do in this crisis out there. But you can look out the window and see you're in a giant orange cloud and know that it's probably not a good idea to go outside if you don't have to. And if you had 3 years of COVID experience, probably wearing a mask if you have to go outside is not going to hurt you. We didn't need the mayor to tell us that, although it'd be nice if he did a little bit earlier. But the issue is, what do you do with that information if you have to go outside, if you cannot work at home like the white collar workers, if you're doing construction, if you are riding a delivery bike where there's no accountability of, should the delivery app say, we're not going to turn the app on today, you can go out and get your own food, we're going to pay our independent contractors for the day to keep them from breathing in 10 hours worth of toxic smoke. So we certainly have not even begun to ask, never think about answer, what do we do about the two-tiered economy where certain aspects of the economy have to put themselves in danger in these conditions and the rest of us can stay home and sort of parse the mayor's response. I think the second issue in the short term is flexibility, including on the other side, once the immediate event had passed. The schools closed down on Friday, and they announced that Thursday afternoon. You wake up Friday morning, thankfully the air was fine. The air quality was moderate and on the good side of moderate. And at the end of the day, the air quality was good. Kids could have gone to school. They would have been perfectly safe. We don't seem to have learned our lesson from COVID. These kids can't miss another day of school. Test scores are worse than they have ever been in history. There's no guarantee that children's air quality is better in their apartments at home than it would have been in the school building. So to shut down schools Thursday afternoon and not wake up at 5 a.m. Friday and say, you know what, we're going to send the kids to school. They have to get out there to school. It shows a real lack of flexibility when flexibility is what we are going to need more of in unpredictable crises. Same thing with the libraries closing. If you don't have air filters, air conditioning in school, maybe you would have wanted to go to the library and breathe in their clearer air on Thursday afternoon, but yet they just suddenly shut down when the workers were already there. So it wasn't a matter of should they go to work that day or not. A sort of bureaucratic inflexibility and erring too far on the side of shutting things down in the crisis and not reopening when the crisis is over. And then, the rest of us are safe and not too worried about the Uber Eats delivery guy who's not so safe out there.
And what about, and maybe I'll open this up to all of you, what about the press? And what about this tendency every time there's a weather event to jump immediately to, well, this is evidence of climate change? Not that anyone in New York doesn't believe in climate change or what its impacts would be, but we always seem to jump to, well, this is what the world is going to be like next week, and we all have to start battening down the hatches. Is that the right way to report on events such as this?
I don't think there's anything wrong with saying clearly with drier conditions, with more drought conditions, even if someone just accidentally threw a match or someone purposely set an arson fire, no matter what the precipitate cause of a specific fire, drier, hotter conditions are going to mean these fires burn faster and longer. All of the issues of should we be managing the forests better than we are. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm an expert on Canadian forest management. I'm sure part of that is true as well. I think the bickering over was this climate change or was this an accident? It's not very useful. Clearly, we are going to see more of these events, and we have long-term plans to address climate change, but we seem to have great difficulty in changing our day-to-day lives in the short term. If you can't go out and get your own food and save the delivery guy breathing in this air, what are you going to do to change your lifestyle to avoid long-term climate change? This is what none of us want to ask or answer. And so this is why we have a very careful veil of separation between what is happening in the long term, and I don't have to worry about it until 2030, because that's none of these city mandates have any teeth until 2030. And what am I doing in the short term, which is sort of lament the long-term effects, but continue to live my day-to-day life as usual.
And let me go ahead, Brigid. I'm sorry.
Well, I think, to building on a little bit of what Nicole was saying, I think there's also a risk to allow some of these events, whether it's something like a Hurricane Ida or these wildfires, be framed as just unprecedented, these single time events that, will never happen again, when there is evidence that we have seen, that is a portion of Queens that has had a history of flooding for year after year after year. And then, these are issues that need to be addressed. And if we don't talk about them in a broader context, then it's hard to get people to make these longer term investments. And we're seeing it even in the budget fight right now. Local Law 97, as the commissioner talked about, the climate mobilization law, this is a bill that will require a lot of work from the city to make sure that people are actually adhering to these standards. And we're looking at city agencies that are facing budget cuts. And so how do you achieve these longer term goals, even when you know that, yes, unprecedented things can happen, but if you are putting in long-term plans, you then have to fund the ability to meet those goals. And we have a hard time even doing that. So I think that it's important not to just look at these things as one-offs or as unprecedented or as, something that is just happening because of this one unique set of circumstances, but to keep in mind that there will be more of these types of events that can happen, and we need to take action to be able to address them.
And maybe, Errol, if we can take it from Quebec back to New York. 10 years ago, we had, 10 plus years ago, a terrible event, Hurricane Sandy. Brigid, as you mentioned, we've had other weather-related events that signaled what the future might hold for us as climate change comes to pass. Commissioner Aggarwala talked a little bit about the investments that the city is making in order to protect us from a future in which climate change is going to quickly become a reality. What is your assessment as someone who watches the city closely about how we're doing? Are we better prepared than we were 10 plus years ago? Are we heading in the right direction? What could we be doing differently?
Oh yeah, I think we are heading in the right direction. Some of what the commissioner said about combined sewage overflows dropping from 100 million gallons down to 17. That's great. That's a big deal. That's something to be celebrated. I think the passage of the Climate Mobilization Act and setting lofty standards is probably the right way to go. Our newsroom and other news organizations have slowly, I think, begun to sort of create some beats and allow reporters and encourage and support reporters who want to develop a certain amount of expertise and some contacts and some familiarity with both the language and some of the timelines and so forth. News generally is built for what's happening right now and maybe tomorrow. And, long term is considered talking about something that's going to happen next week. It's very difficult in that context to set yourself up to tell a big, long story that's really going to stretch out over years, if not decades, and start to educate the public about all of the many different issues that are involved. So I think the city itself is doing an okay job. Newsrooms are catching up with the idea that this is not a series of one-offs. This is a beat. This is a big, big story. This is the story of a lifetime or of a generation. And we've got to figure out how to do it. And you do it on the installment plan. You've got to tell the story this week, next week, and on and on and on, hopefully building some expertise, not only in your newsroom, but in your audience, so that we're all talking about this in a better, more informed way at the next election, when there's the next policy fight, when there's the next storm, and so forth.
And let me ask you, Nicole, just picking up on what Errol was saying, you often write in your column in the Post and in your writings outside of the press about some of the challenges that the city and state and the region have in large infrastructure investments, the costs, the delays. From your perspective, how do you think we're doing 10 years on from Sandy? Do you think that we have made the improvements that we need to make, and what do you think we need to do differently?
I agree with Errol. I think from an infrastructure perspective, we're doing well. Some of the things that the commissioner was saying, this is a good news success story of how infrastructure investment pays off, not only in that every morning we get up and we know that we have clean drinking water and that the toilet will flush, but we have invested in flood controls, in the bioswales in particular, starting to look at these green spaces that can take some of the runoff. We are getting to be in a better position when it comes to public infrastructure. Of course, some of the large scale flood wall programs, the one that the U.S. Army Corps has proposed, those things seem to be somewhat troubled, but on the local and to some extent the state level, we're doing a good job of understanding the infrastructure we need to build or improve and beginning to build and even complete some of these flood control and flood mitigation projects. I think where we're failing in resiliency is more on the private side. How do we, and nothing is private because the government is the rescuer of last resort for everybody. How do we make people who are living in illegal basements, how do we make them safer for when their basement apartment floods? We saw multiple deaths in the storm just 2 years ago. We have hundreds of thousands of people living in illegal basement apartments because they cannot afford other housing. The city does not seem to have come up with a very good answer to that. So as we increase the city's population and more people coming to the city are not in a financial or a personal position to say, well, I shouldn't live in the basement. What is the city's government's responsibility to make sure that those people are safer? That's something that we haven't even begun to answer.
And maybe just to wrap up, I feel like we could talk about this for an hour or more. But just on the sustainability side, moving away from resilience, the commissioner talked about Local Law 97. Local Law 97 takes a stick approach to encouraging or forcing owners of real estate to make their buildings more energy efficient, imposing potentially significant fines on those buildings that don't meet standards starting in 2024 and then ratcheting up in 2030. From what you hear, all of you on the ground, do you feel like we as a city are prepared for that, and that the city in turn has set up the kinds of programs that might be necessary to help not just large and wealthy building owners, but the owners of smaller apartment buildings or low rent apartment buildings, or not-for-profits that own their facilities, for them to be prepared for what's coming with Local Law 97? And I'll let any of you answer that question.
I have my doubts about what is coming, to be honest with you, Seth. The reality is we're seeing already, I've been moderating some city council primary debates, and because co-op buildings, especially large co-op buildings, are not exempt from the law and are going to have to dig in their pockets and basically tax themselves to get more money from each co-op owner in order to pay for retrofits and renovations, there's going to be a lot of political pressure to start creating little side doors and off ramps and exemptions and cutouts and delays. I can't imagine, from what I know about the people involved, the politicians involved, I don't know if they can resist that kind of pressure. I don't know if they want to resist that kind of pressure. And so I think it will be really interesting and very important to see if we can have an administration that's going to hold the line and tell people, you know what, nobody's getting out of this. If you need to go borrow some more money from a bank, maybe we can backstop your loan, but you're going to have to do this. I have no reason to think it's going to happen, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, one small example that should give us all some pause is that we've had recycling laws on the books for years. And I think, you know, the diversion rate is what, 16%, maybe 20%? You know, all of those bottles, all of that cardboard and paper waste, it's just not happening. And so unless there's a serious plan for enforcement, I think it'll just be numbers on a page, and it'll be good intentions, but it won't necessarily take off and take effect.
And what about the opposite side of that coin? If in fact the city does hold the line and doesn't create those off ramps, but the small co-op building or the rent regulated building in the Bronx is forced to dig into their pockets and make these investments or face potentially significant fines. Does that concern you at all? Is that something that you're hearing out in the field as you're reporting on this topic?
Well, that's what everybody fears will happen. And all of the categories of groups that you just described, they all have advocacy organizations or trade associations who are going to very eloquently make the case that it will kill the economy, it will tank the real estate market, it will chase people out of the city, we can't do it. There's always a good reason not to do the right thing on climate, right? There's a good reason. So I think we're going to hear all of those. You know, but again, part of getting it right. I mean, I see where what you're implying here is that getting it right means also giving people the means to actually comply with the law. You know, so if we're serious about it, just as I said, there are credit programs, there are loan programs, there are revolving credit facilities that could be created. There are ways to help people comply if that's what we really want. You know, they could also have at least considered the most straightforward thing, which would be to just tax everybody and get the thing done, as opposed to, you know, basically creating this kind of use tax that's going to fall very unevenly on the various building owners.
Well, clearly this is a complicated topic and a topic that we and others will continue to discuss going forward. I wanted to thank the three of you, Nicole, Errol, Brigid, for your time. And I look forward to engaging on the next topic shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you.